This is a story about a softball game that was played in the schoolyard at PS 241 in Brooklyn in the fall of 1947. In the fall of 1947 and before and after, on Sunday mornings after my old punchball game or stickball game on Montgomery Street, I would walk the 2.5 blocks to the schoolyard at PS 241 to watch the young men of the neighborhood play softball. I was the only one of my Montgomery Street friends who went up to watch those games, but I loved them. In order to understand this story a little better, I have to start by explaining what the schoolyard was like. It was a typical New York City schoolyard in the sense that it was concrete, surrounded by a chain link fence, but unlike other schoolyards, it was rather small and very asymmetrical. My mother's schoolyard, on the other hand, was a city block long, and there could be 2 softball games played at once, but my schoolyard was very small. And because of that, there were special ground rules. One of the ground rules was that a fly ball over the right field fence, which overlooked the tracks of the Broadway shuttle, as we called it, was a ground rule out. It was considered that fence was so close to home plate that it wouldn't be a ground rule double, it wouldn't be a ground rule single, it would be a ground rule out. It was only when a ball went over the center field fence that it would be a ground rule double. The back side of PS 241 was the left field wall, and there were a couple of small entranceways into the school, and a ball landing on the roof of one of those entranceways would be a ground rule single, because that was considered the proper result of a fly ball out to that short left field fence. The point I'm making is games were not won in the schoolyard by big hitting, but by defense and defense and defense. And that was the philosophy that all the games were played under: play good defense. I want to mention one other preliminary thing before we get to the story. In the fall of 1947, I was in the middle of my torrid love affair with Damon Runyon, the great sports writer and short story writer. Damon Runyon was famous among all my friends for the wonderful nicknames he gave to his Broadway characters. And many, many of the ball players who played in the schoolyard had Damon Runyon type nicknames. And these nicknames made the players even more heroic and mythical in my eyes than they ordinarily would have been. So I'd like to introduce you to some of the great nicknames from the fall of 1947. Blimp Tarashinsky. Blimp got his nickname for obvious reasons. He was a big, heavy guy. And even though he lost about 40 pounds while serving in the Army during World War II, he was still called Blimp Tarashinsky. Another obvious nickname was Cus the Greek. The fellow's name was Custis, and he was Greek. He had another nickname, too. He was called the fastest man in the schoolyard. Salami Bender. People who didn't know used to think that Salami Bender was a nickname with sexual connotations. It wasn't. Salami Bender's father was Saul, one of the owners of Ben and Saul Kosher Delicatessen, which was located on Franklin Avenue, a half a block from the schoolyard. Ben and Saul's Kosher Delicatessen was probably the most famous store on Franklin Avenue. Mole Schimmel. Mole Schimmel was a very famous hardball high school pitcher, but he was also a pretty good softball player. Mole Schimmel was not in the CIA, he was not in the OSS, he wasn't one of those spy kind of moles. Mole Schimmel got his nickname because of the size and the shape of his nose. And the size and the shape of his nose were both spectacular. He looked like a mole. Now, Mole Schimmel accepted his nickname with great equanimity, except one day, when apparently he was upset about something else, he really smacked the guy for calling him Mole. Really beat him up. And so the nickname committee met in emergency session and decided that henceforth Mole Schimmel would be called Elam, which was mole spelled backwards. And I'm happy to tell you that there are no reported cases of anyone getting beaten up for calling him Elam. Tubby Lederman. Tubby Lederman was also the heir to another Franklin Avenue store, Lederman's Bakery. Tubby Lederman was not nearly as big and fat as Blim Tarashinsky, but he was big enough to have the nickname Tubby. There were two brothers named Max and Ira Rubenfeld, strong, powerful, terrific athletes who didn't have traditional nicknames. What they had was this. They were never referred to individually, but always in the conjunctive. They were known as the Rubenfeld brothers. Let me explain what I mean. If Max Rubenfeld was walking along Franklin Avenue or by himself, the guys at the candy store wouldn't say, "Here comes Max." They wouldn't say, "Here comes Max Rubenfeld." They would say, "Here comes one of the Rubenfeld brothers, Max." And the reason for that very strange situation was a famous schoolyard fight which took place on a Sunday when, alas, I wasn't present. I never got a great clear story about how that schoolyard fight started, but every 5-year-old in the old neighborhood knew what happened once the fight started. And this is what happened. The Rubenfeld brothers moved to the center of the baseball diamond, and there they stood back to back. And standing back to back, they fought very successfully, either 5, 6, or 7 opposing players, depending on which version of the story you chose to believe. And besides the Rubenfeld brothers bit, there was one other practical result of that famous fight, and that was this. Whenever the Rubenfeld brothers showed up early on Sunday, they were expected to choose up sides, because if they chose, that meant they were going to be on opposing teams. And if they were ever on opposing teams, there was less likelihood that they would ever have to stand back to back again. By the way, I always thought that was a very romantic concept. Two brothers standing back to back, taking on the world. Now for the main character of my story. I won't call him the hero of the story. I'll call him the main character. His name was Marty Seltzer. And Marty got his nickname because of a cardboard display in the window of a neighborhood pharmacy that was located on Franklin Avenue, directly across from Ben & Saul Kosher Delicatessen. And the cardboard display was for Bromo Seltzer. And because of that display, Marty got the nickname of Homo. He was called Homo Seltzer. Now, I don't think Marty Seltzer or Homo Seltzer was a homo, although I admit in those days I didn't exactly know all about those things. Homo Seltzer was a center fielder, and among ball players who prided themselves on their defensive ability, Homo Seltzer was a defensive superstar. When sides were chosen, he didn't wait for his captain to assign a defensive position. He would just trot out to center field because he knew center field belonged to him, and quite rightly. Homo wore the same gray sweatshirt, the same gray sweatpants, the same black sneakers every single Sunday. He had a gray face and a gray personality, but boy, could he play center field. Now at last, here's the story. The vast majority of games in the schoolyard were choose up. That meant that at 7:30 or 8 o'clock on Sunday, as soon as 18 players appeared in the schoolyard, the Rubenfeld brothers or 2 other big shots would choose up sides, and there'd be a 7-inning game. And when the game was over, the losing team would leave the field, and the 9 players waiting next would come on to play the winners. If there weren't 9 players waiting, players would be chosen from the losing team. And the games would go on till 1, 2 o'clock on a Sunday, depending on the weather, depending on whether there was an important Dodger game to watch. whether the Sunday was a Mother's Day or something like that. By the way, the reason I'm wearing my Dodger paraphernalia to tell this story is because I believe this story is a very, very Brooklyn type of story. Anyway, despite the fact that most of the games would choose up, once in a blue moon, PS 241 would challenge or be challenged by another schoolyard to an all-star game. And this was one of those occasions. We challenged PS 161 to an all-star game. By the way, Iris and Jerry, PS 161 was located near where your Aunt Rose lived. Anyway, the Rubenfeld brothers, as de facto captains, and no one was going to argue with that, went off to meet their counterparts to discuss the ground rules for the softball game. I don't know all the ground rules that were discussed, but at least three very, very important ground rules emerged. The first important ground rule was that the game would be 9 innings, not 7 innings. The second important ground rule was that the bet would be $10 a man, not $1 a man, which was the usual Sunday bet. By the way, $10 was a lot of money in those days. And one other side comment, no one could ever figure out exactly how much was bet by the friends and colleagues of the two teams. The general estimate was $2,500 were the side bets. And to put that number in context, I doubt if anybody on the PS 241 team made $2,500 a year back in 1947. Anyway, the third ground rule was extremely important. It was decided that the game would be played with 10 players instead of 9. That meant there would be a short center fielder. When Homo Seltzer heard that it was planned to be a short center fielder, he confronted the Rubenfeld brothers and told them that if they believed he couldn't cover center field by himself, he would just as soon not show up to play the game. Well, the Rubenfeld brothers explained that this was a rule that the other team insisted on, and besides that, when PS 241 was on defense, the extra outfielder would either play short left or short right as the situation required, and Homo would have center field all to himself. This satisfied him, and he agreed to play in the All-Star game. Well, when the big Sunday came, I skipped my old punchball game. I wanted to get to the schoolyard early to get a good standing room spot. There were no seats in the schoolyard. Everybody stood, and I got a very good spot. Max Rubenfeld was going to pitch. Ira Rubenfeld was going to catch. Custer Greek was at short. Homo Seltzer was in center. The other people I mentioned were either not on the team or on the bench. And it was a terrific game. Max pitched a beautiful game. The other pitcher pitched even better. Max gave up a run in the top of the fourth on a couple of singles and a couple of ground balls. We tied it up in the bottom of the fourth on an infield hit by Custer Greek, a couple of outs, and some very daring base runners. Max did not give up another hit through the 8th inning, and we didn't get another hit through the 8th inning either. The top of the 9th, the score was still 1-1. The first batter for PS 161 led off with a single, the first hit that Max had given up since the 4th inning. A strikeout and a ground ball followed, and so the potential winning run was on second base with 2 out. But not to worry, the next batter coming up had struck out the last time and really looked sick doing it. But he didn't strike out this time. Max pitched, the batter swung and hit a medium hard line drive past Max's handsome head out of a second into short center field. To catch that ball, Homo Seltzer had to come in and slightly to his left, 6 or 7 feet, and then reach down below his knee. There wasn't one person in the schoolyard that wasn't 100% sure that Homo Seltzer would catch that ball. But he didn't. Homo came in 6 or 7 steps, reached down below his knee, and the ball hit the heel of his glove and bounced. The one and only time in my life I saw any expression on Homo Seltzer's gray face was this time, and the expression was pure shock. He recovered quickly, picked up the ball on a bounce, fired home to Ira Rubenfeld. Too late, too late. The lead run had scored. For some reason, the schoolyard was quiet for a few seconds. Nobody could believe that an important run had scored on an error by the great Homo Seltzer. After those few seconds, a muffled cheer went up from the visiting side and a muffled groan went up from the home team side. Max Rubenfeld got the third out, I have no idea how, and the last of the ninth was a foregone conclusion. 3 easy outs and a horrible, horrible 2-1 loss. Within hours of that final out, the old neighborhood in Brooklyn was divided into 2 camps. The large majority blamed Homo Seltzer completely and unequivocally for the loss. His error in center field became known as the $100 error, and ball fans from Bensonhurst to Bay Ridge, from Brownsville to Borough Park, heard of the $100 error. I was in the minority. I, of course, understood that Homo Seltzer's error led to the winning run. But the way we were hitting and they were pitching, I felt we could have played 3 more days and not gotten another run. So I certainly wasn't in the majority camp. A strange thing happened with my relationship with Homo Seltzer after that era. I was 4 years away from entering Columbia College, where I studied the Greek tragedies as a freshman. But somehow or other, I pictured Homo Seltzer as the hero of a Greek tragedy. He had reached the top of the world as a super baseball player and then crashed into the depths of despair, all because of a fatal flaw, his overweening pride, his hubris, his refusal to have a short center fielder play in front of him. But after a while, I began to look at Homo Seltzer as a plain old Brooklyn type of hero, and this is what I mean. Week after week, month after month, year after year, Homo Seltzer showed up at the schoolyard every Sunday. He never made the slightest excuse for his error. He never complained at all about the horrible treatment that he received from his friends and teammates and colleagues. He just kept taking his gray face out to center field every Sunday. And in all the years till I left the old neighborhood, once and for all, I never saw him make another error.